Every evening at exactly 6:15, after the hum of the restoration binding presses died down and the heavy iron doors of the archive swung shut for the night, there was a sound in the corridor outside my office, a single, quiet tap of a fountain pen cap clicking into place. It was never loud enough to serve as an announcement, but it was consistent enough that I could set my watch by it. For 4 years, that tiny metallic snap was the only signal that we were the last 2 people left on the 3rd floor of the Blackwood Preservation Trust in Charleston. We never left together, and we never arrived together. We never met outside the high brick walls of the courtyard, and we never spoke a single word that could not have been recorded on an official ledger. That was the boundary, drawn on my first day and held without a single crack until the end. My name is Genevieve Cross. In the autumn of '09, when I was 31 years old, I took a position as the associate conservator for the rare folio collection at Blackwood in South Carolina. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. The sequence of small, ordinary events is the only way to understand what came after. When I accepted the job, I was brought in to assist Harrison Prescott. Harrison was 44 at the time, the senior director of special acquisitions, a man whose quiet, measured demeanor made the vast, cedar-paneled rooms feel even larger than they were. He was married to a woman named Cecilia, an accomplished violist whose framed photograph sat on the corner of his mahogany desk, positioned precisely so that anyone sitting across from him would see her smiling against a background of dark velvet curtains. Harrison's commitment to his wife, and to the institution he had served for nearly 2 decades, was not a secret or a point of tension. It was simply the floor upon which everything else rested. Our routine was established within a fortnight. The Blackwood Trust was housed in a late 19th century building with drafty tall windows, creaking cypress floors, and an elaborate filing system that required 2 sets of keys for the rare document vault. My desk was situated in the outer office, positioned directly beside the glass-paneled double doors that led into Harrison's study. Every morning at 8:30, he would walk past my desk, offer a brief nod, and say, "Good morning, Genevieve." Every afternoon at 1 o'clock, he would leave for 20 minutes to purchase a plain black tea from the corner cafe, returning to place a small paper napkin on the edge of my blotter if my own mug was empty. And then came 6 o'clock. At 6, the rest of the research assistants, the junior binders, and the administrative clerks would file out toward the stairwell. The chatter about dinner plans and evening commutes would fade down the hall, and the outer doors would latch shut. That was when the silence settled, thick, heavy, and comfortable. Harrison would remain in his study with the door slightly ajar, the warm light from his green banker's lamp spilling across the threshold onto the heart pine floor of my workspace. I would stay at my desk until 6:30, rekeying catalog numbers or conditioning delicate leather covers with preservative wax. It was during those 30 minutes after everyone had left that the atmosphere changed, though nothing explicit ever marked the transition. During the day, our interactions were strictly transactional, requisitions, verification of dates, requests for cross-referencing. But in that half hour of quiet, the space between us stretched into something lingering and observant. 3 small things belonged entirely to that routine. The first was a small, brass-mounted magnifying loupe that had belonged to the trust's founder. Harrison had given it to me on my 3rd week, placing it gently on my ledger without a word of explanation. The second was a specific phrasing he used whenever an uncatalogued manuscript presented a complex riddle. He would stop near my desk, lean his forearm against the edge of the tall bookshelf, and ask, "Where does the seam give, Genevieve?" The third was the way he paused at 6:15, capping his pen with that quiet metallic click, remaining motionless at his desk for a long moment as if listening to the old building settle. As the months turned into years, the unspoken weight between us grew not through words or physical contact, but through an acute awareness of each other's presence. I learned the cadence of his footsteps, the exact rhythm of his breathing when he was deep in thought, and the way his brow would furrow slightly right before he made a decision. He, in turn, seemed to know my habits before I fully recognized them myself. If a sudden coastal squall began to hit the tall windows late in the afternoon, my umbrella would appear leaning against my umbrella stand, moved there from the coat closet without me ever seeing him carry it across the room. I remember an afternoon in late November. A heavy fog had rolled in off the harbor, smothering the gas lamps along the street. The other staff members had hurried out early to beat an impending storm. By 5:30, the floor was entirely silent. I was standing on the library ladder in the fourth aisle, reaching for a folio on the top shelf, when the ladder gave a slight wobble. I caught myself against the shelf, dropping a portfolio of untranscribed letters. The papers scattered across the polished floor like dry leaves. Before the sound had even finished echoing, Harrison was at the foot of the ladder. He didn't reach up to touch me, nor did he offer his hand to steady me. He simply stood there, his face illuminated by the low light of the hall, his dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made the air feel suddenly thin. "Are you secure, Genevieve?" he asked. His voice was lower than usual, stripped of its formal academic tone. "Yes," I whispered, holding the wooden frame of the ladder tightly. "I am secure." He didn't move away immediately. He stood there for several seconds, looking up at me, the distance between us no more than 2 feet, yet rendered completely impassable by everything we both held dear. Then, with deliberate slowness, he knelt on the floor and began gathering the loose pages, placing them neatly in order before stacking them at the base of the desk. He did not look back up as he returned to his office, but as he crossed the threshold, his hand brushed the edge of my desk, his fingers lingering on the brass corner for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Others noticed, of course, though there was nothing concrete for anyone to point to. One afternoon, Deborah, a senior cataloger who had been with the trust for 20 years, paused by my desk as she was packing her bag. She looked at the fresh cup of tea Harrison had left on my blotter, then glanced toward his closed door. "He doesn't bring tea to anyone else, Genevieve," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle, cautious curiosity. "Not even the trustees." I kept my eyes on the index card I was writing. "Mr. Prescott is simply thorough about office courtesy, Deborah. He knows I work through the afternoon." Deborah sighed, adjusting her scarf. "Courtesy usually has an hour when it stops. Mr. Prescott's courtesy seems to start right around the time the rest of us go home." I didn't answer. I couldn't. To acknowledge her observation would have been to give a name to something that relied entirely on remaining unnamed. If we named it, we would have to address it, and to address it meant it would have to end or transform into something that neither of us was willing to permit. Private theories occupied my mind during those late afternoon silences. I wondered if he felt the same quiet pull that tugged at my chest whenever he walked into the room. I wondered if he sat at his desk after 6 o'clock counting the minutes until I packed my bag, or if he was simply a lonely, dedicated scholar who found comfort in the presence of another quiet worker. I told myself it was professional admiration. I told myself it was a shared devotion to the dust and history of the archive. But deep down, I knew that every time he capped his pen at 6:15, he was listening for the sound of my breath across the quiet room. The obstacle between us was not a misunderstanding, nor was it a bitter obstacle created by external enemies. It was simple, solid, and honorable. Harrison loved his wife. Cecilia was a woman of deep grace, and though her musical engagements kept her traveling frequently, the bond between them was built on years of shared history and genuine affection. Harrison was not a man who broke vows or treated commitments lightly. His integrity was the very quality that made him who he was, the very quality, I realized with a quiet pang, that made me respect him so profoundly. To cross the line with me would have destroyed the man I cared for. To let him cross it would have made me someone he could no longer respect. The boundary was tested only once, directly and undeniably, during my 3rd year at Blackwood. It was an evening in early spring. A severe electrical fault in the basement had forced the building to close early, and by 3 in the afternoon, the floor was completely empty. Only Harrison and I remained on the 3rd level, working under emergency oil lamps while waiting for the municipal inspector to arrive. The usual shield of institutional routine was stripped away. There were no phones ringing, no footsteps in the corridors, no pretense of a normal workday. I was working at the long oak table in the center reading room, sorting through a newly acquired collection of plantation record books. Harrison walked out of his office, holding a lamp. The warm yellow light threw long shadows across the floorboards. He walked over to the table and set the lamp down between us. "The building manager says it will take 2 hours to restore power," he said, his voice quiet in the hollow room. "You don't have to stay, Genevieve. I can wrap up the cataloging." "I don't mind staying," I replied, looking up at him. "I prefer to finish what I start." He stood across from me, the light rising between us. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't return to his desk. He pulled out the wooden chair opposite mine and sat down. We were so close that I could see the tiny flecks of silver in his dark eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the neat stitching on the cuff of his linen shirt. "Genevieve," he said softly. "Just my name. No title, no archival inquiry." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The silence in the room became absolute, so thick I felt as though I could reach out and touch it. Everything was in that moment, the 4 years of silent teacups, the umbrella moved in the rain, the held glances across crowded meeting rooms. All he had to do was reach his hand 3 inches across the oak table, and everything would change. All I had to do was lean forward. He looked down at my hands, which were resting flat on the blotting paper. His fingers twitched slightly, taking a micro-inch forward on the wood. I held my breath, every nerve ending in my body drawn tight. He closed his eyes for one long, agonizing second. When he opened them again, the sudden, fierce intensity was gone, replaced by a quiet, devastating calm. He drew his hand back, placing it neatly over his other wrist on his knee. "The light is fading," he said, his tone entirely level, though his voice bore a faint tremor. "We should lock the vault before the sun sets completely." "Yes," I said, my throat dry. "We should." Neither of us moved for another moment. We simply sat there, acknowledging the choice we had just made. We had stood at the edge of the precipice, looked across at each other, and deliberately stepped back. Nothing was said, yet everything was decided. The boundary held. Time moved forward, as it always does. A year later, in the summer of my 5th year at Blackwood, the Institute underwent a major restructuring. A prestigious historical trust in Halifax offered me the position of chief conservator, a promotion that represented everything I had worked for professionally. It meant moving out of the country, leaving Charleston, and leaving the 3rd floor of the Blackwood building. When I gave Harrison my notice, he received the news with characteristic composure. He sat behind his desk, his hands clasped over his leather-bound planner. "It is a well-deserved advancement, Genevieve," he said, his voice measured. "They are fortunate to have you." "Thank you, Harrison," I said. "I have learned a great deal here." On my final day, the staff held a small reception in the afternoon. There were speeches, a store-bought cake, and formal well wishes. By 5:30, the room had emptied out as usual. The other conservators shook my hand and bade me farewell. At 6 o'clock, I was alone at my desk, packing the last of my personal items into a small wooden crate, my notebooks, my desk clock, and the brass-mounted magnifying loupe he had given me years before. At 6:15, I heard it, the click of the fountain pen cap in the inner office. Harrison stepped out of his study. He was wearing his overcoat, his hat held in his hand. He walked over to my desk, looking down at the empty blotter. "I wish you every success in Halifax, Genevieve," he said. "Thank you, Harrison," I replied. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on the brass loop tucked safely into my crate. "Take care of your work." "I will," I said. "Where does the seam give?" A small, sad smile touched the corner of his lips, the only time I had ever seen such an expression on his face. "The seam gives where it was meant to, Genevieve." He offered his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, warm, and brief. He turned and walked down the long corridor, his footsteps fading into the distance until the heavy front doors clicked shut. I moved to Halifax. I built a life there. I threw myself into my work, reorganizing the maritime paper archive, publishing papers, and eventually purchasing a quiet stone cottage near the harbor. Over the next 6 years, Harrison and I exchanged formal holiday cards once a year, brief notes wishing each other well, signing off with professional cordiality. I convinced myself that what we had shared was merely a shadow, a fleeting moment of quiet companionship that I had inflated in my own mind out of loneliness and youth. I told myself that he had likely forgotten the 6:15 pen cap clicks, the moved umbrellas, and the long silences in the reading room. Then came the discovery. 6 years after I left Charleston, I received a phone call from Silas Bennett, the senior trustee of the Blackwood Trust. He informed me that Harrison had retired from his post due to failing health, and that the board was preparing a retrospective catalog of his 40-year tenure. Silas asked if I would be willing to return to Charleston for 3 days to review Harrison's personal administrative archive, a task that required someone familiar with his notation system and methods. I agreed. Returning to Blackwood felt like stepping into a dream that had frozen in time. The red brick walls, the tall drafty windows, the smell of aged paper and leather preservative, everything was unchanged. But the third floor was quiet in a different way now. Harrison's desk was clear, his framed photo of Cecilia was gone. On my second afternoon, I was sitting at my old desk in the outer office, going through a stack of archival acquisition logs from my years there. Silas Bennett walked in, carrying a dark metal filing box labeled Director's Personal Discretionary Account, Private. Harrison left explicit instructions that this box was only to be processed by you, Genevieve, Silas said, placing the heavy box on my desk. He said you were the only one who would understand the cross-referencing. After Silas left, I unlocked the box with the small key attached to the folder. Inside were financial records, trustee correspondence, and personnel files dating back a decade. As I flipped through the documents, a thick manila folder labeled with my name caught my eye, Genevieve Cross, Professional Retention and Support, Confidential. I opened the file, and as I read through the contents, the entire foundation of my memory began to shift and recalibrate. During my second year at the trust, the Board of Trustees had faced severe budget cuts. I had been told at the time that my position had been permanently funded through a grant from an anonymous cultural foundation. Looking at the records before me, I saw the truth. There was no foundation. Harrison had personally transferred 25% of his own annual director's salary into the trust's endowment every single year to pay my salary. He had written private letters to the board, pledging his personal annuity as collateral to ensure that my position was never eliminated. In one letter to the head trustee, dated 6 months before I left for Halifax, Harrison had written, "Miss Cross's presence and scholarly rigor are indispensable to the integrity of the archive. Should the board determine that her salary cannot be sustained by institutional funds, I request that the attached reduction in my own compensation be executed immediately to cover the deficit. She must not be informed of this arrangement under any circumstances, as it would compromise her professional standing and independence." My hands began to shake. But that was not all. Further down in the folder was a collection of correspondence regarding my appointment in Halifax. I had always believed that the Halifax Institute had found me through an independent search committee. The documents showed that Harrison had quietly orchestrated the entire offer. He had spent 7 months writing detailed recommendations, contacting former colleagues on the board in Canada, and personally guaranteeing my credentials. He had negotiated a higher starting salary for me than they had initially budgeted, quietly agreeing to curate an annual monograph series for them without pay in exchange for their commitment to my tenure. He had built the bridge for my departure. He had spent years paying out of his own pocket to keep me near him, and then spent months using his influence to ensure I could leave for a better life, all without ever saying a single word to me, without ever asking for a glance of gratitude, without ever letting me know I was indebted to him. I sat in the quiet office as the afternoon sun faded from the window. 6:15 arrived. The silence was absolute. The sacrifice had contained no bravado, no dramatic declaration. His house was a modest clapboard cottage overlooking the marshlands. Cecilia was in the garden when I pulled into the driveway. She greeted me warmly, her eyes kind, and pointed toward the porch that faced the water. Harrison was sitting in a wicker chair, a woolen blanket wrapped around his knees. He was frail now, his hair was entirely silver, and his skin had the translucent look of age. But when he turned his head and saw me, his dark eyes cleared with immediate recognition. "Genevieve," he said softly. "Hello, Harrison," I replied. I pulled up a small wooden bench and sat beside his chair. The sound of the wind through the marsh grass filled the space between us. "You processed the discretionary archive," he said. It was not a question. "I did," I answered. I pulled the brass magnifying loupe from my coat pocket and placed it gently on the small table between our chairs. "You didn't have to do it, Harrison," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The salary. Halifax, you gave away so much." Harrison looked out at the water, his face calm and unreadable. He did not offer an apology, nor did he frame his actions as a confession of romance. The restraint that had governed our years together held firm, even here, at the end. "A conservator's duty is to preserve what is valuable, Genevieve," he said gently. "Some things are too rare to be left to chance." "You never told me," I said. He turned his head to look at me. "If I had told you, it would have been for my sake, not yours. You needed to soar on your own merit, without feeling the weight of an obligation." "And the 615 pen cap?" I asked, a tear finally slipping down my cheek. A soft, warm light touched his eyes. "I always waited until everyone had left, Genevieve. Because those 30 minutes were the only time in my day when the world was entirely honest." We sat together on that porch for another hour, watching the tide roll through the marsh. We didn't hold hands. We didn't talk about what might have been if the world had been different, if we had met at another time, or if choices had been made differently. Nothing external changed. He remained with Cecilia. I returned to my archive in Halifax. What broke that day was not the boundary we had kept for so many years, but my own limited understanding of what love could be. I had spent years thinking that love was defined by what is shared, spoken, and possessed. Harrison had shown me that love could also exist in what is withheld, in the quiet protection that asks for nothing in return, in the discipline of holding a line so that another person might stand secure. Every evening now, in my quiet office in Halifax, when 6:15 arrives and the building grows still, I stop working. I take the brass magnifying loupe from my desk drawer, set it on my blotter, and listen to the silence. I think of the red brick building in Charleston, the green banker's lamp, and the man who waited until everyone had left, just to give me a world where I could thrive. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.